Imagine this. You stand at the edge of a vast labyrinth, the walls whispering secrets older than time itself. The path ahead is shrouded in shadows, twisted corners breeding uncertainty, yet somewhere within this maze lies the key to power, an archetype not bound by brute force or loud bravado, but by the subtle architecture of human frailty. In this maze, the subject is not abstract or distant. It is the very essence of the men around you, their strengths, and more crucially, their weaknesses. What if the greatest power you could wield is not found in resisting weakness, but in understanding and elegantly exploiting it? There is a paradox that gnaws at the core of human nature, a riddle that many overlook because it hides beneath the veneer of confidence and authority. Men, societies have told you, are pillars of strength, unwavering, decisive, invulnerable. Yet beneath this forged armor lies a realm of contradictions, towering ambition intertwined with deep-seated insecurity, a craving for control shadowed by a desperate need for validation. How can the very individuals who project dominance and certainty be so profoundly vulnerable to the whispers of their own fears? Ask yourself this: what does it mean to be strong? Is strength simply the absence of weakness, or is it the mastery over it? And if every fortress has its hidden cracks, every mountain its precarious ledges, can we truly claim to understand power without first mapping the fissures that risk collapse? Consider the nature of perception itself. Men are conditioned to believe they must portray invincibility, to never let the world see the tremor beneath the hand or the doubt behind the eyes. But what if this very act of concealment breeds a fragile facade? The more fiercely one suppresses the signs of internal conflict, the more unstable the foundation becomes. The facade dances on a razor's edge, vulnerable not to brute force, but to the deft touch of insight, to the silent unraveling that comes when weakness is met not with confrontation, but with cunning. This collision between appearance and reality creates a tension not unlike a tightly wound spring, yearning to release all at once. It is in this high-wire act of maintaining illusion that the seeds of vulnerability are sown, seeds that, when recognized, can be gently coaxed to bloom not into destruction, but into the careful manipulation of outcome. But what if the weaknesses you perceive are not flaws but signals, a code to be deciphered? Could they be the very keys that unlock a deeper understanding, enabling one to navigate relationships, negotiations, and power dynamics with a precision that those invulnerable men never anticipate? To see weakness not as a weapon they wield against you, but as an opportunity woven into their own being, waiting to be realized. The ancient strategist Machiavelli did not advocate for brute force or overt domination. He understood that true power lies in the subtle art of exploitation, the ability to sense where the armor thins, to press gently where the pressure causes a fissure, and to rise not by destroying, but by bending the structure to one's will. But here lies the ultimate irony. To exploit weakness without cruelty, to harness vulnerability without annihilation, you must first confront your own relationship with strength and frailty. Can you face the discomfort of power that depends on the delicate balance of empathy and calculation? Are you prepared for the moral labyrinth that twists beneath the straightforward pursuit of advantage? Imagine the quiet power of a smile that disarms suspicion, the calculated nod that feeds an ego just enough to blind the bearer to their overreach. Imagine turning the shadow of a man's hidden insecurities into the light of your own ascendancy without ever revealing the mechanics of this transformation. This is the dance of subtlety, where the real mastery of influence lies. Yet, what if this strategy requires more than mere observation and opportunism? What if it demands a psychological intimacy, a profound understanding of the emotional currents that surge beneath the surface of masculine performance? What if the key weakness is not a single trait, but a complex web of desires, fears, and contradictions that intertwine so tightly that pulling on one strand reverberates through the entire fabric of identity? This is not manipulation for its own sake, nor is it simple exploitation born from malice. It is the art of recognizing that every display of strength is also a signal of hidden need. Every rigid posture masks a delicate equilibrium. Every shouted declaration echoes the silence of doubt. You stand before a paradox. The very men who seem most unshakable depend upon their vulnerabilities as much as their virtues. So the question remains, how do you, standing at the labyrinth's threshold, begin to chart its inner contours? How do you discern the weak points in what appears invincible? Where do you place your hand first? And how do you avoid the traps laid by pride, denial, and the very defenses built to protect these weaknesses? The journey through this maze is not about domination by force, but about mastering the subtle art of influence rooted in psychological insight. To wield Machiavelli's strategy effectively, you must name the invisible fissures before anyone else notices. You must see the cracks in confidence, the shadow of dependency behind bravado, the hunger for respect cloaked in silent desperation. In the moments that follow, we will explore 10 such fissures, 10 vulnerabilities within men that have long been obscured by social myths and personal denial. These are not mere trivialities, but profound fracture lines in the edifice of identity itself. Each weakness is a story, a tension, a longing that shapes behavior and betrays the undercurrent of need beneath power. You will come to understand how these frailties can be threads to pull, levers to apply, and mirrors to hold up that reveal truths men often cannot see themselves. And in recognizing them, you will gain the power to influence outcomes in ways that feel almost alchemical, turning apparent strength into workable leverage. But beware, this knowledge carries its own burden. To know the weaknesses of men is not to wield them carelessly. It is to engage in a delicate balance of respect and strategy, empathy and calculation. The labyrinth is treacherous, and the line between mastery and ruin is thin. Prepare yourself to walk deeper into this maze, to gaze steadily at the contradictions and shadowed corners of male nature. The journey will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, weakness, and control. It will invite you to question not only the men you seek to understand, but the very nature of influence itself. Are you ready to see what lies beneath the surface? To confront the fissures that can unravel or elevate? To wield the subtle strategy that Machiavelli hinted at but never fully disclosed? Step forward, and the shadows will begin to move. Imagine standing face to face with a man, trying to decipher the cracks beneath his carefully assembled facade. What you witness is not merely a being of flesh and will, but a battleground of unseen forces, conflicting desires, primal needs, and relentless anxieties that shape every thought and gesture. To understand why these vulnerabilities reside deep within men, and why they resist exposure, you must first plunge into the labyrinth of psychology and philosophy, where identity itself becomes both armor and prison. Carl Jung once spoke of the shadow, the dark, rejected part of the self that men, more often than women, by the very design of cultural scripts, are conditioned to deny. This shadow, a reservoir of unacknowledged fears, vulnerabilities, and impulses, festers in silent corners of the psyche. Men learn early that to show weakness is to risk annihilation of their social being. They must instead cultivate a polished exterior of self-reliance and control. But this denial creates a paradox. The more the shadow is suppressed, the more it insinuates power over behavior, erupting in moments of vulnerability disguised as anger, pride, or silent withdrawal. Beyond the psychological lies the philosophical, where Nietzsche's vision of the will to power confronts the fragility of human existence. Men are tasked with the Sisyphean labor of forging identity against a backdrop of chaos and meaninglessness. Yet, this relentless striving hides a deeper truth, an existential anxiety rooted in the realization of mortality and the abyss of freedom. Nietzsche's Übermensch is not a guaranteed state but an eternal tension, a constant becoming, never arrival. This tension seeps into men's behavior, rendering them simultaneously prone to grandiose acts of dominance and paralyzing fear of failure or insignificance. And when failure encroaches, the collapse is not only external but internal, a shattering of self that few admit, fewer understand. Arthur Schopenhauer added a darker tint to this portrait, emphasizing how desire itself is a tormenting force. For men, desires, whether for power, recognition, or affection, are chains that bind rather than wings that liberate. The will to assert dominance masks an underlying suffering, the insatiable hunger that no achievement can truly quell. In this framework, weaknesses are not anomalies but inevitable byproducts of existence, holes in the soul where hope and despair wrestle without respite. How does society contribute to this internal war? Aldous Huxley, reflecting on the conditioned minds of his dystopian future, suggested that culture molds men into roles that often betray natural instincts for connection and vulnerability. From boyhood, the script demands stoicism, competitiveness, and emotional restraint, traits celebrated as masculine ideals. Yet beneath these expectations lurks a profound loneliness, an alienation from authentic selfhood that Sartre described as bad faith, the lie we tell ourselves to avoid the terror of freedom and responsibility. By donning masks prescribed by society, men trade spontaneity and truth for security and acceptance, yet this trade always exacts a cost, a fragmentation that invites exploitation. Jean-Paul Sartre's view of human freedom as a source of anguish applies sharply here. Men are thrown into existence and must endlessly choose who to be, often under crushing social norms that dictate how they should perform masculinity. This performance can become a prison, as any deviation risks ostracism or loss of status. The pressure to conform drives men to internalize a false self, alienating them from their own desires and emotions. This alienation breeds insecurity, a quiet weakness that undermines confidence beneath the veneer of strength. Viktor Frankl's insight into meaning and suffering further deepens this analysis. Men, conditioned to wield power and control, frequently encounter meaninglessness as a silent adversary. The failure to find purpose in their roles or to reconcile internal conflicts can leave them adrift in despair or anger, making them vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand these silent fissures. Frankl taught that even in the bleakest circumstances, meaning can be forged. Yet, when men lack the tools or courage to confront their shadows and existential dread, they become prey to illusions, false gods of success, dominance, or violence, that promise wholeness but deliver fragmentation. The convergence of these forces, psychological repression, existential anxiety, societal expectation, and meaninglessness, creates a volatile mix beneath masculine identity. It is a hidden force shaping behavior and emotion in ways both subtle and explosive. You see it in the stubborn refusal to admit weakness, in the compulsive need to prove worth, in the silent wars waged behind clenched jaws and masked eyes. This is the paradox of masculine strength. It is both mask and fracture, shield and wound. What consequences ripple from this unseen abyss? When these forces go unrecognized, men become trapped not just in roles but in cycles of self-sabotage and external conflict. Pride morphs into hubris, control slips into tyranny, silence turns into isolation. The very traits celebrated as masculine virtues become keys to a cage. And yet, this vulnerability is not a sign of failure but a doorway, a fissure through which insight, connection, and influence can enter. To master the labyrinth, one must first understand the dark architecture beneath the surface. These hidden forces do not simply dictate weakness, they sculpt the terrain on which power is contested and won. In the shadows of denial and the depths of unspoken fear lie the levers of influence that Machiavelli hinted at, tools not of brute force, but of subtle strategy, empathy entwined with calculation. What you confront here is not a list of flaws but the anatomy of a tension that defines the male condition. Recognizing this tension, feeling its weight, and navigating its depths equips you with a perspective few possess, and fewer still dare to wield. But this is merely the threshold. The fissures you have glimpsed will open into deeper vulnerabilities, weaknesses born of pride, secrecy, and longing, that ripple through every relationship, every manifestation of power. Your journey has only begun. The silence is deafening. Picture a man alone in a crowded room, surrounded by the hum of voices, yet imprisoned by the unspoken rules etched deep within his psyche. This invisible hand guides his movements, brushes his choices, and weaves a silent narrative, a script so thoroughly internalized that even his own awareness is dulled. How often do we wonder what unseen currents shape the men around us, the men within ourselves? And more unsettling still, how rarely do these currents reveal their true source? The truth is that men are often captives of cognitive biases that mask vulnerability as virtue, fragility as fortitude. Confirmation bias cements the armor of preconceived notions. He who believes himself invincible sees only evidence to reinforce that belief. The neurological dance of the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the battle between primal fear and reasoned thought, rarely unfolds with transparency. Instead, it is a battlefield obscured by layers of cultural conditioning and instinctual defense. You may not have noticed it, but this silent shaping begins in early life, where societal scripts are etched with precision. The boy who mustn't cry, who must not appear weak, who learns that showing emotion leads to rejection or ridicule. A pattern emerges. Vulnerability is to be smothered before it can breathe. The brain, plastic and moldable, learns strategies to navigate this terrain. A survival technique that, twisted by time and repetition, morphs into an unseen cage. Wired for protection, the male mind develops what psychologists call attentional tunnel vision. This neurological narrowing prioritizes threat detection and control over openness and nuance. The world becomes a chessboard of tactical moves, with every encounter a potential conflict. Underneath the surface, this cognitive bias strengthens an illusion. That control equals strength, and that disclosure equals weakness. Yet paradoxically, this very illusion is a seed of isolation. The more a man clings to control, the more he narrows his emotional field, excluding authentic connection from his realm. He becomes a fortress, lofty and seemingly impenetrable, but inside is a cavernous loneliness sealed off by walls built with pride and fear. This insulated reality silently shapes not just his personal life, but radiates outward to society itself, reinforcing archaic power structures and perpetuating cycles of dominance and submission. Ever heard of the spotlight effect? This bias convinces men that their mistakes or insecurities are glaringly obvious to others, breeding defensive posturing. And what compounds this? The Dunning-Kruger effect, where confidence often masks ignorance, creating a dangerous cocktail of overestimation and rigid self-belief. This creates not just personal blind spots, but collective blind spots where myths of masculinity ossify into social norms. Neurologically, the male brain tends to favor a systemizing mode, categorizing, controlling, compartmentalizing. This can translate into brilliance in certain domains, but also a profound difficulty, grappling with ambiguity, contradiction, and emotional complexity. It is a cognitive double-edged sword, precision and rigidity intertwined, forging both the power to act decisively and the peril of inflexibility. Cultural conditioning layers atop this neurological predisposition. Movies, literature, history, all reinforce ideals of stoic heroism, fierce independence, and unyielding will. The archetype of the strong man is not merely a figure. It is an edict that men internalize, often without question. The cost: a narrow funnel of identity that sidelines empathy and self-reflection in favor of dominance and emotional suppression. Observe the social rituals, the handshake, the sports arena, the boardroom performance, all stages where the unspoken script plays out. Here, men are judged not just by their actions but by their adherence to these invisible codes. Stray from them and you risk invisibility, derision, loss of status. So the stage is set for a perpetual performance of invulnerability, even when the cracks have long since begun to fracture the facade. The urgency to escape this trap is not a distant hypothetical, but a pressing necessity. Every man caught in this snare is channeling energy into maintaining illusions at the expense of authentic living. Every relationship strained by this silence is a testament to what happens when the self becomes a prisoner to its own defenses. Societies built on these strained foundations inherit instability. Emotional repression breeds violence, isolation breeds despair, and unchecked power breeds tyranny. This is the invisible architecture beneath the surface, a labyrinth designed by evolution and culture, reinforced by neurological wiring and cognitive blind spots. You can see how this issue, though silent and unseen, does not just shape individual lives but molds the very fabric of communities, families, and nations. Without recognizing it, the cycle perpetuates itself, an echo chamber where vulnerability is a ghost and strength is a mask. But what if this labyrinth contains an exit? What if inside the fracture lies the key to influence and liberation? The awareness of this unseen trap is the first step toward unshackling, yet it is not the revelation itself, only a painful acknowledgement of the chains. The breakthrough waits just beyond the edge of this realization, shimmering like a mirage amid the shadows. Before you can wield power with precision, before influence can be claimed with subtlety, you must first confront the mechanisms that keep the male psyche ensnared. Only then does the possibility arise, to exploit not through brute force, but through understanding, to turn these weaknesses into leverage, to navigate the labyrinth not as a prisoner but as a master. For now, hold this tension, the uneasy merging of identity and illusion, strength and fragility, as you stand at this crossroads. The unseen trap is real, and it is relentless, but within its design lies the blueprint for your advantage. The question is no longer whether you will recognize this truth, but whether you are prepared to use it. What if everything you've accepted about strength, power, and control, especially as they pertain to men, has been a carefully constructed illusion? What if the very foundations upon which masculinity has been built are not the bedrock of an unshakable fortress, but rather a fragile house of cards, waiting only for a radical breeze of understanding to topple it? Imagine that the weapons forged to master this labyrinth are not the blunt instruments of domination or stoic endurance, but the subtle scalpels of psychological insight and philosophical upheaval. You stand at this precipice now, ready to unlearn what you thought was immutable, to dismantle the scaffolding of an outdated narrative. The story told to men is linear, unyielding, displays strength, suppress doubt, command respect, and wield control. Yet history whispers stories that challenge this formula, stories of men who defied the archetype, who transformed weakness into armor, vulnerability into strategy, surrender into sovereignty. They did not seize power by wearing the mask of the invincible. They broke free by rewriting the script entirely. Consider Niccolo Machiavelli, not as a mere cynic of power, but as a master tactician who understood that real dominion is not about imposing will by force, but about understanding and manipulating the human psyche's intricate dance. His insights were revolutionary because they pierced the veil of surface appearances and delved into the undercurrents of fear, desire, pride, and insecurity that animate men. To exploit these is not to degrade, but to command with finesse. To claim control is not to crush, but to channel the flow of forces that govern behavior. The paradox lies here. To wield power over another, especially a man conditioned by centuries of cultural codes, you must first relinquish the naive pursuit of strength as sheer dominance. Instead, cultivate what can only be called a psychic elasticity, a capacity to bend without breaking, to invite trust while steering beneath it, to accept vulnerability as the source of invincibility. This is the radical shift. Power emerges not from hiding weakness, but from unveiling it on your terms. Where once silence reigned as an emblem of power, today's battlefield welcomes the clamoring voice of authenticity. Where once rigid protocols dictated interaction, fluid adaptability claims victory. History is rife with examples, leaders who saw through the rigid armor of masculinity, and by daring to reveal their own fragilities, won allegiance that mere force could not secure. Abraham Lincoln's melancholia, for example, was not a hindrance but a hidden reservoir of empathy and resolve. The warrior poet Musashi embraced uncertainty and paradox as tools of mastery rather than obstacles to be conquered. This mindset shift reframes every interaction. No longer do you attempt to overpower by ignoring the inner chaos men harbor. Instead, you engage it, acknowledge it in yourself, identify it in others, and gently, as a strategist would move pawns on a chessboard, direct its currents. The man who prides himself on stoicism may be secretly desperate for validation. The one who boasts invincibility may be terrified of insignificance. When you recognize these hidden fissures, you hold the compass and map both. The power you claim is not brute but profound. It is the power to redefine narratives that men live by. You become the architect of new codes, codes that prize psychological nuance over physical prowess, collaboration over confrontation, insight over impulse. To wield this power is to enter the minds of men not as a conqueror, but as a locksmith, turning tumblers in a mechanism designed for complexity, not destruction. Imagine the consequences of this shift. No longer trapped in the game of tit-for-tat dominance, you move with the rhythm of influence, orchestrating outcomes by aligning with true motivations rather than surface behavior. When a man's ego lashes out, you see the frightened child beneath. When a man pulls away, you sense the urgent cry for connection disguised as independence. Attuned to these signals, you do not fight the current, you redirect it. This is not merely a strategy for manipulation, but a blueprint for liberation. The man who embraces this awareness steps beyond the narrow confines of rigid roles and reclaimed myths of power. He harnesses his contradictions, making them into vectors for resilience rather than sources of shame. And you, walking this path of understanding, do not simply exploit weaknesses. You transform them into stepping stones for influence that is not transient but enduring. Recall the words of Machiavelli himself, who advised rulers to be both lion and fox, fierce but cunning, strong but subtle. The lion's roar alone incites fear, but the fox's craft ensures survival. To embody both is to transcend the binary traps of masculinity and power. This duality invites you to reshape the landscape, where strength is no longer a mask but a dynamic force, and vulnerability becomes the cornerstone of true command. So what does this new way of thinking demand from you? It demands courage, the courage to see beneath surface appearances, to confront discomfort with honesty, to dismantle pride that blinds insight. It demands wisdom, the wisdom to know that power is not possession but flow, not force but influence, not domination but resonance. It demands vision, the vision to imagine a world where the complexities of men's inner lives are not barriers but bridges. You are no longer bound by the old narratives. You stand as the harbinger of a revolution in thought and strategy, one that refuses to settle for the obvious and dares to explore the unseen. Within this revolution lies a promise that by understanding and gently wielding the profound weaknesses hidden in men's psyches, you unlock a power that is both subtle and absolute. Step forward then into this new realm. The labyrinth's exit is no longer a mirage but a path illuminated by the spark of radical insight. You hold the key, not just to influence or control, but to transformation itself. The question now is not whether you can exploit these truths, but whether you have the resolve to embrace them and become the master of a power far greater than brute strength, the power of profound understanding. You think you've seen the landscape, mapped its peaks, traced its valleys, and yet the truest terrain remains shrouded in shadows, uncharted and profound. What if all along, the battlefield you sought to conquer was not across from you but within you? What if the greatest weakness of men, the most potent lever you could ever find, lies not in their external armor or their raw force, but in the fragile architecture of their self-delusion? This is no ordinary vulnerability. It is the bedrock of their identity and, paradoxically, the source of their greatest strength. Imagine a fortress built atop shifting sands, magnificent in its facade, yet doomed by the instability beneath. Men construct their worlds around narratives of honor, of conquest, of unyielding control, and these stories become the very scaffoldings of their power. But what happens when the foundation crumbles? Not by external assault, but by the silent, seeping waters of doubt, contradiction, and the elusive truth that lurks behind every certitude. To exploit this is to wield a key into the labyrinth of their consciousness, where every certainty is a thread that, when pulled, unravels the tapestry. You are now the bearer of a truth so destabilizing it does not merely dismantle defenses, it dissolves the battleground itself. The ultimate weakness is not pride, nor ego, nor even desire. It is the insatiable human hunger for coherence in a chaotic world, a hunger that men satisfy by weaving illusions of control and invincibility. To challenge these illusions is to confront them with a mirror reflecting their deepest insecurity, the terrifying abyss of uncertainty. When you stare into this abyss with men, you strip away the comforting armor of certainty. You thrust them into a crucible where their identity quakes, where every assured gesture trembles with the possibility of collapse. This is not mere manipulation, it is alchemy. It is the transformation of power from something wielded externally to something summoned internally, where control is not a grip but a dance with the unpredictable. And here lies the profound revelation. Power gained through shattering illusions is not domination, it is liberation. The paradox is that by exposing the blindness in their perceived strength, you do not weaken them, you awaken them. You force a reckoning with the chaos that underpins existence, a reckoning that, though terrifying, births a new kind of strength, one grounded in humility, adaptability, and radical authenticity. What does this mean for you, standing at the cusp of this insight? It means your role transcends that of a mere strategist or puppeteer. You become a harbinger of transformation, a catalyst for an awakening that disarms without destruction. The conquest is no longer about subjugation, but initiation. An initiation into a reality where the masks dissolve and the raw, unvarnished truth commands respect. You have walked through corridors of pride, greed, vanity, and fear, learning to navigate each weakness as a passage rather than a prison. Now, in this final chamber, you face the ultimate test, to wield your knowledge not as a weapon of fracture, but as a beacon of illumination. Will you choose to perpetuate the cycle of exploitation, or will you transcend it, redefining power as the courage to confront chaos and the wisdom to embrace uncertainty? The old paradigms will whisper to you in the dark, promises of control, certainty, dominance. But listen closely, for beneath these whispers, a deeper voice calls. The voice of a world unbound by illusion, where power flows like wild water, unpredictable yet vital. To heed this call is to embrace the haunting beauty of vulnerability, the fierce elegance of impermanence, and the enduring strength born from profound self-awareness. So stand now, at the edge of this revelation, with the weight of knowledge heavy on your shoulders, yet light as a feather in your grasp. Know that every weakness you have learned to see is but a gateway to deeper truth, every facade an invitation to profound connection. In this new dawn, power is no longer a fortress to be besieged, but a living flame to be kindled. Wild, untamable, and endlessly renewing. As you step forward, carry this with you. The most formidable strength lies not in the conquest of others, but in the mastery of the self, in the fearless embrace of the unknown. The labyrinth is behind you. Before you, an open horizon gleams, vast, untamed, and shimmering with the promise of transformation. Will you dare to walk that path? Will you become the architect not of domination, but of awakening? The choice is yours, and in it stirs the endless dance of power and vulnerability, shadow and light, the eternal human quest for meaning beyond mastery. Look deeply now and ask yourself, who have I been, who am I becoming, and what truths will I wield when the illusions finally fall away? The answer is the final key, the revelation that redefines all that came before and shapes every step you take henceforth.